What I want to talk about today is the National Building Energy Standards Setting and Assessment and Rating Framework, which I'm going to call the framework, just for short. It's a measure that's been being developed for some time now. Some of you may have been involved in public consultations previously. And it's a chance to tell you where government officials are up to with their thinking. It's at this stage not endorsed by any government, but officials have put this together to identify where we're up to and where we think the framework might go. And it's a chance to get some feedback from people on what they think of that. And in particular, there's some specific issues we're particularly interested in, but any feedback on the framework will be welcome. So for those who, so I'm just going to talk about the National Strategy on Energy Efficiency, which is where it derives from originally, a bit about the objectives of the framework, what's in it, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. Because we are recording this one, at this stage I'd probably ask if we leave all the questions till the end because it just works better in the webinar framework. But please note down your questions as you go and we'll come back and talk about anything you like. So the framework is part of the National Strategy on Energy Efficiency, which was agreed to by COAG. COAG is the body of the Prime Minister and all the premiers of all the states and territories. And they agreed to a package of, I think, 37 or 38 measures to improve energy efficiency in the Australian economy. And the NESE, as it's called, has 4 main sections which are discussed here. So it has things about assisting with households, which incorporates skills and data collection and industrial energy efficiency and a variety of other things. There's section on reducing impediments, a lot of which is about MEPS, which is minimum standards for appliances. If you bought white goods, you'll notice the star ratings, and it incorporates that. There's a whole chapter on buildings, and that's a recognition of the importance of buildings to energy efficiency and the opportunities there. And then also there's a section on governments sort of leading the way in terms of energy efficiency performance. And that also has a lot to do with buildings because a lot of that's about how governments manage their own buildings to show how they can be more energy efficient. So the national strategy is really there to try to look at a set of measures that will together significantly enhance the uptake of energy efficiency in Australia. This framework measure that we're talking about today itself is related to a number of other measures in the package. And I don't know whether it's better to actually see it as a sort of umbrella over a number of them or a podium that a number of them sit on, but the framework itself supports a lot of these. So some of you will be familiar with commercial building disclosure. It's a measure that came into full operation last year, which requires that large office spaces, when they're sold or leased, have to disclose their energy performance at the time of sale or lease. And obviously underlying that is a lot of tools work, which relates to the framework. There's discussion going on at the moment about a residential building disclosure scheme, which would be a similar sort of scheme in some ways for houses. Not yet in place, but being discussed, and again would need to rely on tools and standards and those sorts of things. There's been developments in 2010, the Building Code of Australia, which is now called the National Construction Code, included new energy efficiency requirements for both residential and commercial buildings. And again, standards is a very important part of this framework. And there's some data collection work and information work, things like Your Home and others, that also rely on a lot of the things that are in this framework. So the framework is I guess an enabling mechanism in a lot of ways for a lot of these other measures, as well as having some specific measures included in it itself. In terms of why governments are interested in the energy efficiency of buildings, and there's some pretty obvious things. If we can make buildings more energy efficient, they produce less greenhouse gas emissions, and that's important. Probably as important is the fact that it can save money, saves energy and therefore saves money, and therefore is a way of increasing the productivity of commercial businesses and making the economy as a whole more competitive. Effectively, it's a way of delivering both greenhouse and economic benefits simultaneously, and that's very important. There have been studies done both in Australia and all around the world to look at cost-effective opportunities, and it shows that typically most studies will show that you can save 30 to 40% of energy in buildings at basically zero net cost, and so there's tremendous potential there that needs to be taken up. In terms of its link with the carbon price, most of you will probably have heard of the carbon price. That comes into force on the 1st of July. So that will introduce a $23 a tonne carbon price on major emitters in Australia. And over time that will then transition to a fully tradable emissions trading scheme. The carbon price will then, those emitters will the prices of those will flow through to the economy in various ways. Most significantly, this will increase the price of energy, probably by around 10% in terms of electricity. That's the sort of estimate. And so people ask, well, why do we need all these other energy efficiency measures? Isn't the carbon price really going to drive all this change? And the answer is, I think the answer is yes and no. So it will drive some change. Obviously, increases the profile of energy, it increases the price, and therefore makes it more attractive to invest in energy efficiency. But we know that in the building sector in particular, there's a whole range of things that market failures that mean that price doesn't flow through effectively to final behavior. Two most important ones are information failures, where people just don't know what their energy efficiency performance is, or what they can do to improve it, or what the costs of that are. And the other is what we call split incentives, which is typically called the landlord-tenant relationship. So typical case would be where a landlord pays for capital equipment and the tenant pays for energy costs. So the landlord doesn't want to pay for it because they don't want to pay for the capital equipment, and the tenant can't change the capital, and so they can't make the savings, and so there's these split incentives. There's also a number of other issues about just past practices. The way things have been done in the past aren't always the best. So the idea with this framework is to support measures that address these specific market failures as a complement to the carbon price, which means that over time, the carbon price doesn't need to be as high to deliver, because these measures will help us to deliver savings at very low or negative costs. And that means that we don't need such a high carbon price in the long term to achieve the sort of objectives that we need to achieve. So it's an integrated part of a package to address greenhouse. Now, the framework itself, what it actually consists of is basically it's got two main elements. One is energy efficiency standards, and how we increase energy efficiency standards for buildings over time in a systematic and coherent way. And the other element is rating tools, both voluntary and mandatory rating tools, and how they can create a more coherent system of rating tools that people can understand and use more easily to achieve those policy outcomes that we want to achieve. Covers residential and commercial. It will apply to new and existing. We'll talk about the switch from the building envelope to fixed appliances. Very importantly, it's the standards work is very much on an outcomes basis. So we're not specifying technologies, we're specifying the sorts of energy efficiency outcomes that want to be achieved, and then allowing industry to respond in the way that's most cost effective for them. The framework also does talk about including other sustainability elements, particularly water. I'm not going to talk about that much today. There's a little bit about water that I'll get to. The key focus of the framework and the discussions to date have really been on the energy side. So the idea is to, again, get a more strategic approach and consistent approach to standards and a more coherent system of rating tools for buildings. So, and as well as the sort of direct economic benefits, the three things I think the framework's trying to deliver: certainty, so that industry knows much better how standards are likely to move in the future, how they're going to be measuring their performance, so that they can then plan in advance for how to meet those future standards in a better way. It increases flexibility, so it allows, as we'll come to, some trade-offs between thermal shell and fixed appliances and other ways to address energy efficiency, so that it gives more flexibility for people to meet those requirements. And it's more consistent in the sense of trying to provide a system which looks more similar across different states and territories, so that industry has a better understanding of what they're likely to do. So, very specifically, there's three things I wanted to talk about in terms of the framework. And this one, I should say, this is the framework. I assume you've all seen this since you're here, so you've probably looked on the website. It is available on the website. It's all on that table as well as that we have USB keys, which has this document, as well as 3 or 4 other research reports that I'll be talking about as we go through. And it also has the form for those who want to make a submission. So I encourage you to pick up one of those USBs before you leave. So we're going to talk about the goals for improved energy efficiency in buildings and how we see that sort of going forward. Talk a bit about how we see the tools possibly moving more into a coordinated system, and a very little bit about the governance of rating tools for the future. So, oops. Okay, now I've done it. Apologize for this. So, when we talk about the goals in the framework, so this is basically about trying to set a pathway for future energy efficiency standards that will be implemented probably through the Building Code of Australia. The reason we talk about goals rather than standards themselves is that at this stage we can't set actual standards for the future. That's done through a regulatory impact assessment process at the time that the standards are set, and has a lot of specific rules and a lot of detail about how that has to be done. What we're trying to do here is, in the first instance, is set a pathway so that even prior to the setting of those standards, industry can get a sense of where standards are likely to head. It applies to new buildings and applies to alterations and additions. And new buildings are only 1 or 2% of the building stock in any given year, but they last a long time, and so it's very important that efficiency standards for buildings move ahead over time so that we keep up with technology and practice and expectations, because what we build now can be locked in for quite a long period of time. And again, the standards would be implemented through the National Construction Code. Now, one of the key things that the document talks about is changing the way that standards are set. So currently the way standards this is for residential buildings, are set in the National Construction Code is on the building fabric. So basically there's a standard for how much heating and cooling load a building should need to keep itself within a standardized climate range. As well as that, in the 2010 building code, there was a separate standard for lighting, 5 watts per square meter, 5 watts per square meter, and also some requirements in terms of hot water and what sort of hot water systems you could install. 3 separate sort of standards, and they all had to be met individually. What the framework is talking about is moving to a system where, rather than having those separate things, the building fabric and the fixed appliances, heating and cooling and hot water appliances, would all be combined into a common standard. And as the standard moves forward, builders could decide to meet that standard either through improved building fabric or improved lighting or a better hot water system or a variety of other things they can look at. There are issues to be sorted out in terms of exactly how you do that. How do you match up a building with a 50-year lifestyle with a hot water system which might last for 10 years? But in principle, this is the sort of approach that's being done. And in a New South Wales audience, this approach moves the National Construction Code in the direction of what Basics does. So it's more like Basics than it was, although it's not entirely the same. The reason for this, we'll come to a graph in a little bit that talks about it more, but one of the fundamental reasons is that in residential standards in particular, we've already pushed the thermal shell reasonably hard. There's room for improvement, but it's been pushed pretty hard. And each time we push it harder in the current system, we're starting to get fairly small marginal improvements. And so some of the big savings in the future are likely to come from some of the non-building shell sort of issues. Another issue that's come up in terms of setting standard is currently in residential standards, on-site generation is not included in the standard. It is to a degree in commercial buildings. When we looked at what future standards might look like, one of the issues that came out quite starkly was the role of photovoltaics, PVs. There are extremely plausible scenarios in which by 2020 at least, photovoltaics become cost competitive with basic electricity supply. Recently, the AEMO, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator, released a study which said that they now anticipate significant penetration of PV into the market because of the fact that the prices have come down so dramatically, and it is now already becoming cost competitive in some ways. The issue this raises for building standards is if you incorporate on-site generation as part of your standard, and if you accept that they become cost competitive, it's hard to argue for anything other than a zero emission standard as the long-term standard, because that can be achieved cost effectively. So clearly that issue we need to look some more at. We did then have a look more at this issue, and one of the concerns it raises is that that's quite true on a household by household basis, but it's not clear that it's true on a system-wide basis. So when you have large penetration of PV into the system, create certain challenges for the system in terms of ancillary services and network reliability and those sorts of things. We need to make sure that we don't set a building standard that drives problems in the sort of energy market, the broader energy market. So one of the studies that's on the USB and was on the website is a study by Energetics, which looked at some of these issues. And they're real issues and they need to be looked at. I think the general conclusion was that they're not insurmountable issues, that for all sorts of reasons, we're probably moving to smarter grids in the future. We're going to have to invest a lot in our networks in the future, and therefore these sort of issues can be handled, but they can't be ignored. But I think they also said that their recommendation, I think, still is focus a lot more on the building itself because that's probably a more cost-effective way to go. But given where prices of PV are going, I'm not sure how much that's changing. So that's something that we need to do more work on, and we're interested in views on as well. In terms of the system then of how we would see standards moving forward, the idea would be to set pathways for the future that would look out probably on usually about 10 years. So for example, if we pick these ones, we would have a pathway of what we would expect a standard possibly to look like in 2015 and also what it might look like in 2020. Then when we get closer to 2015, we would go through the actual standard setting process, the regulatory impact statement, and all the analysis and consultation that needs to go into actually setting the standard. And then in say the 2015 BCA, that standard will come into place. And at the same time, we would then produce a pathway for 2025, so that all the time there's always sort of 2 5-year steps that are identified so that there's a longer term picture of where standards are likely to go. But we still have to go through the formal regulation setting process for the current regulation. And that's to deal with the fact that we can look out 10 years, but lots of stuff changes, and we need to make sure that when we actually get to setting the standard, we do it based on the best information we have at the time. So that's the sort of broad system. That then translates in specific terms differently in the residential and commercial sectors. So if we talk about the residential sector, because of the fact that the residential sector's standards have probably been pushed a little bit harder, there's not a strong case for a really big improvement in 2015. We'll come to the actual numbers. And also, because of this change to the methodology, it's going to take some time to change all the tools, get industry familiar with the methodology, get that methodology rolled into the building code, all that sort of stuff. And so the general thinking is that in 2015 we would change to the new methodology, but not actually change the stringency, basically leave the stringency pretty much as it is. And when I say stringency here, it's the stringency in terms of the thermal standard plus the lighting standard plus the hot water, and combining that into an overall sort of approach. But by 2020, there will be room for improvement. So by 2020, people are familiar with the system, and then we can go and look at a change. And as with all the standards to date, there needs to be variability to address climate variability. This just shows what I was talking about a bit earlier in terms of where standards have gone in the future. So you'll see that the first building standards for residences were incorporated in the Building Code of Australia in 2003. At the time, there were no standards before. I think the average new house, we reckon, was about half a star, maybe a star. And so there's quite a big improvement in terms of heating and cooling energy use from going from the, here up to here. Then in 2006, we introduced the 5-star, or the Building Code introduced the 5-star standard. Much smaller increase as you went from around 3.5, 4 to 5. And then in 2010, they moved to 6, and that's an even smaller improvement because that's the sort of curve that the star system is based on. So what we can see is, on the thermal shell performance, we're starting to get to these, not insignificant, but smaller energy efficiency improvements as we go forward. So what are the X's, well, what's that X number that the residential sector we might look at in terms of improvements? One of the other studies that's here on the USB is a Pitin Cherry study, which was to look at exactly this issue of what might be some indicative goals for 2015 and 2020. And this slide just summarizes some of the, how that analysis was done. Effectively what they did both for the residential and commercial was to take a variety of buildings and with expert assistance look at different options on how they might improve energy performance to different levels, including going right down to zero emissions, and then basically look at a cost curve and find the point at which costs and benefits were equalized. So all these numbers are set on the basis at which the cost of improving energy efficiency matches the benefits from improving energy efficiency. Now, clearly in doing that sort of analysis, there's all sorts of assumptions that are put into there, and this just summarizes, some of the key ones. So it did look at a whole range of residential buildings incorporating both standalone, attached and unit residential buildings. Looked at a number of different types of commercial buildings, that the results are all relative. When we get to the numbers, they're all relative to BCA 2010. So all relative to this idea of the 6-star thermal shell standard, plus the lighting standard, plus the hot water requirements. In terms of the costs, the energy costs were based on the projections that were made as part of the the Clean Energy Future Package analysis of the carbon price. So they look at cost increases in the future, including the price of future carbon costs. Now, I think one of the issues that's come up is already in a number of jurisdictions, energy costs have increased a little bit faster than that. But over time, well, I guess we'll see what happens. But that's the assumptions that were made there. It assumes a 7% discount rate. So, it assumes that something that happens 20 years in the future is worth a lot less now than it is if it happens now. There's enormous discussion in the literature of what the right discount rate for these sort of things would be. 7% is chosen because the Office of Best Practice Regulation, which basically is responsible for monitoring all regulatory impacts in Australia and regulatory impact statements, uses 7%. It's the number that's justified on their basis of how discount rates can best be used. So that's the number that's used. If that were lower, the numbers would be bigger. It incorporates a 40-year building life, so it assumes that both residential and commercial buildings last for 40 years and counts the benefits over that period of time. And it looked at buildings across the 8 different capital cities and then aggregated the results in those ways. And the results they came up with for the residential sector are here. So what that says is if we leave redesign out for the moment, that by 2015, the cost-effective point would be about an 8% improvement from where we are now, and then by 2020, about a 12%. Now, it varies a bit, but a typical star is worth, I think, about 22, 25%. So that's about a third of a star and a half a star. So you can see that they're not huge improvements, and that's why not making a change in 2015 and just adjusting the methodology is seen as something that might be quite attractive. The greenish line below that, where it's a bit bigger, is one where we incorporate redesign issues to some extent. So currently the way standards are assessed largely in terms of the building code is we take some standard house designs and we start throwing technology on until we meet the new standard. So we put in more insulation, we put in some double glazing, you might, I don't know, put some eaves in. But basically you build new things or you buy new things to put in the house, which in the end is really, you would think is the expensive way to meet a standard. And so one of the issues we asked Pitin Cherry to look at was to say, well, if you looked at redesigning residential buildings in particular, could you get some more cost-effective savings by redesign? And the answer is yes. And that's what those lower numbers show, is what might be possible with some redesign. But it also became clear that we really needed to look at this redesign issue in more detail, which is what we did here. So the other study that's on the USB is a sustainability house study, which looked at this redesign issue in a lot more detail. So it took a number of bulk builder house designs across Australia and basically looked at how they could redesign those houses to achieve the move from 5 stars to 6-star at no cost. And their conclusion was that you can do that. That basically you can get about a star for free, or in fact with I think a 1.3% reduction in cost through better design rather than throwing on technology. And these are through things, orientation is very important, but also things like different floor coverings, glazing size and locations were very important, and also roof color turned out as a fairly important sort of element, which has quite different impacts. And so what this shows is sort of the initial designs, the average of the initial designs that were looked at in each of the jurisdictions, and then the star rating that came after the redesign work was done. And all of that was done without increasing the cost. So what it shows is, again, you can get about a star for free through redesign. And we're now doing some work to look at when we go from 6 to 7-star, whether the same issue arises. And we've only got preliminary results, but the preliminary results confirm the same thing, that you can still get a star for free, more or less. What it means in terms of how builders might design and sell houses is that currently there are a lot of volume builders who effectively have a small number of house designs, and so when they roll things out, you can pick one of the 5 or 6 designs. What it would suggest is, rather than doing that, they can do one of two things. One is have more designs, and so take each design and put it in a different orientation and maybe some climate bits, and have a different set of designs that are available for different circumstances. Or alternatively, just market their products a little bit differently and say, design A is really good if you have a north-facing block, but if you have a west-facing block, you better use design C, sort of thing. So it can be done either through more design or some marketing, but there are some ways for them to address these sort of things. In terms of the commercial buildings, Same general structure, except that because we're not really changing the methodology, there's no reason to have a sort of interim step in 2015. So there'd be an X% reduction and Y% reduction. Again, the variations by climate zone. And these are the numbers that the same Pitin Cherry analysis comes up with for the commercial sector. You can see the numbers here are much bigger. And in aggregate, in sort of general terms, I don't think anybody would be surprised with that. There's been 3 iterations of residential building standards already. When we did the last one, it was already clear that in some cases we were running up against cost-benefit constraints in some climate zones, whereas with commercial buildings, we've only had 2 rounds, and the benefit-cost ratio in the last round was still 2 to 1. So there's still a lot of room to move in terms of a cost-effective standard. The other thing you'll see here is a lot of variation in terms of the different types of buildings. So offices, which is probably where a lot of focus has been in the past, the big offices, the 10-story offices, still significant room for improvement, but not nearly as much as the others. And something like supermarkets, where there's been less attention, you'll see quite dramatic numbers. They're the source of fundamentally 2 things. One is an assumption that supermarkets become much better at capturing waste heat from their internal refrigeration, of which there's quite a bit. And that's one of the big elements. And the other element is, again, PVs. So the assumption to get to 100% is this study looked only at standalone supermarkets. They tend to have quite large roofs. There's a lot of roof space to put PVs on. And again, PVs they're not quite cost effective. They're pretty close. And so basically supermarkets have potential to go and move to effectively zero net emissions. So these numbers do include some renewables, because some on-site generation, because that's allowed. Oh, and there's quite a bit of, in a number of the commercial buildings, there's quite a bit of tri-generation in here. That raises issues about making sure that the energy market facilitates that penetration of tri-generation. There are currently some issues about that would need to be addressed, but that's the sort of assumption that's in there. So again, you can see that quite large improvements in 2015, and then not insubstantial improvements after that as well, but quite a different story from the residential sector. And again, these residential and commercial numbers are things that we'd be very keen to have some feedback on. This just talks about how we might put some of those numbers in context. In both Europe and California, there are strong drives to move towards zero emissions in actually quite short time frames. So in California, they're talking about net zero energy by 2020 for new residential and 2030 for new commercial buildings. The UK has had a zero carbon target for homes for 2016 now for some time. There are some differences in terms of how people define zero emissions, whether it's net or total. But I think you can see that even those commercial building standards are not, they wouldn't put Australia at the cutting edge of these sorts of standards by any means. There are others who are moving faster and farther than we are. Within the standards, there's then a number of other sort of detailed elements that we're looking at. One is this issue of separate heating and cooling. The thinking behind this is essentially about peak load. So in Australia now, all jurisdictions have a peak summer load, which is driven primarily by air conditioning on really hot days. The idea with having a separate cooling requirement would be to, by limiting the cooling requirement, try to address that peak load issue. However, South Australia, who is particularly concerned about this issue because of the nature of their energy needs, is doing some work on whether there's a way to build in a much more specific measure of peak load into a standard or a separate standard to address this issue more directly. But for the moment, we're looking at whether we can just split out the heating and the cooling. Another thing we're looking at is a more nationally consistent approach of standards to alterations and additions. There are rules for that in every jurisdiction. However, the thresholds beyond which they come into effect are quite different, and the implementation of standards for renovations and additions is inconsistent. And so if we can look at doing better there, that would be good. The other issue is minimum water efficiency standards. There's still an intention to look at water efficiency standards, possibly by 2015 in that sort of first round. But it's clear that we're not looking at any system where, for example, energy and water can trade off. They'll be quite separate sort of standards because they're seen as quite different sorts of issues. So that's the sort of story of the main things that are happening in the framework about standards. In terms of rating tools, the key things that we're looking at are trying to move to a system where all rating tools have a consistent 10-star scale. Now currently, NatHERS has a 10-star scale. As we saw, it's a logarithmic scale, so it sort of curves down. Neighbors, which is probably the other most well-known tool, has a linear scale, which goes notionally to 7 stars, I think, as a zero emissions point. The thinking behind this is to try to come up with a system where all the different rating tools would have the same 10-star scale, and the stars would mean the same thing. So currently, 6 stars on Neighbors is as good as you can do. 6 stars on NatHERS is, you know, it's good, it meets the standard, but it's certainly not the best you can do. There's plenty of 8 and 9 and even some 10-star houses, I think, around. And the feeling is that if we can have a system where 6-star always means the same thing, it's going to help people understand how the performance of their house or their commercial building relates to other things. And the idea would be to also try to make this consistent with the rating scale for things like white goods and equipment, so that all consumers get the same message in terms of that star rating scale. This is, it's a place to go. We're not, we're not there yet. The NatHERS tool will need some changes if the framework gets adopted to deal with all those, you know, moving to the more flexible system. So it's an opportune time to look at the rating scale there. Neighbors, you know, may need to look at that in terms of sorting out where it goes with the 7th star at some point in the near future. So there may be time to look at those as well. Again, the detail of how to get this is still to be sorted out, but that's the general principle. The other thing that's being looked at as a sort of longer term picture is to set up a system of rating tools that allows some comparison as you move through the life cycle of a building. So as you design it, you build it, you occupy it. If you can have rating tools that work at each of those stages and are consistent with each other, it means that the rating tools themselves become much better diagnostics about what the real problem is. So that when you get to the use side and you get a 3-star rating, you can tell quite clearly, is that a problem with the way the building was designed, the way it was built, or is it something about the occupancy of the building itself that we need to look at? So that's kind of I guess, a longer term vision for things. And that's where what this alignment between, you know, pre-construction and post-construction is all about. A couple of issues, and this one, again, has a particular relevance, I think, for New South Wales, which has a slightly different system from a number of other jurisdictions. In terms of the normalisation, which is this issue here, so currently the National Construction Code is normalised according to watts per square metre. What that means is if you build a bigger house, it can still be rated as a very efficient house, but it actually uses more energy. The New South Wales system is different. It works on deemed occupants. Is that right? Deemed occupants. So basically the number of bedrooms in the house determines what the sort of assumption is about how many people are likely to live in that house. And so the ratings are normalized by number of deemed occupants. There are arguments either way. Where the group was at, and this was, this generated a lot of discussion, was that some feeling that if you move to a deemed occupancy rating, what you're doing is having government interfere in lifestyle choices to a bit more of a degree. So it's saying, well, if you want a bigger house, you're going to have to make it more efficient, and that's sort of more intrusive. On the other hand, the per deemed occupancy rating has a much clearer way of controlling energy use. So at the moment, I think the group is leaning toward continuing with the per square meter option, but again, views on that would be very welcome. And there's also recognition that we need to update the climate data used in the rating tools more regularly. There was some discussion of whether, in fact, we should think about putting in climate data which sort of predicts future climate, given that the climate itself is changing. The feeling was that's probably not a good idea because it's just too unpredictable, but that perhaps we could look at ways of, currently the way climate data sets are put together is we look over the last 30 years and pick a sort of typical day for each day of the year out of those 30 years. And the idea is you could shrink that down perhaps to 10 years, which means that the climate data will be much more representative of the recent data rather than older data. Again, it's a bit of a tricky area because we're not very good at predicting the future. So we want to be a bit careful about how we do that. But there is a recognition that the climate data needs to be kept up to date as much as possible. Another issue that's come up is the question of single rating tools versus multiple rating tools where there are regulatory requirements. This is primarily an issue in the NatHERS space, the residential space, where currently there are 3 different tools. They all use the same calculation engine, but there are 3 different tools that are accredited for use to meet residential building standards under the building code. There's Accurate, which is a CSIRO tool, BERS Pro, which is owned by SolarLogic based in Queensland, and First Rate, which is currently owned by the Victorian government. All of them can be used to meet requirements through the rating the rating tool system. And the thinking of moving to a single rating tool is, I guess, twofold. One is that as standards become more strict, keeping those tools aligned to make sure they all deliver exactly the same result for every possible house becomes more and more difficult, just because the margins for error become smaller and smaller. And we really don't want a system in which builders can choose which rating tool to use to get a better rating. So that removes that possibility. It also just means that resources spent developing tools can be focused on one tool rather than others. However, on the other hand, there is the argument that that may inhibit innovation and sort of lock in monopolies of tools. And so while the group on balance was going toward a single rating tool, it has asked for specific feedback on this issue, whether people think that's an important issue or not, or whether there's benefits in having multiple tools. And also a recognition that it needs to be clearly identified which tools are for regulatory purposes and which are for voluntary tools. Another area is the question of assessors. What's becoming clear is there's been quite a bit of work to make sure that the different rating tools line up in recent times. The next step is to make sure that the assessors who use the tools are lined up. Now, in some jurisdictions, I think in New South Wales, people who use tools like NatHERS are required to be accredited or certified or something. But in some jurisdictions, they're not. Basically, there's no restrictions on who can actually use these tools. And one of the recommendations in the current draft framework is that wherever a tool requires this professional judgment, where it's not just a self-assessment tool, that it would be carried out by accredited assessors or licensed assessors to ensure better consistency among assessors as well as amongst the assessment tools. At the same time, we don't want to inhibit the use of non-regulatory tools. There are plenty of non-regulatory tools in the market which are quite useful for all sorts of purposes. Oops. All right, now and the final thing is the framework looks at how we can collect a better set of national data. So currently what happens is, when people get ratings, they're sort of given to the council or the state government, whoever the approval authority is, and with some exceptions, they tend to sort of sit in different places and not come together into a national database. So for example, one of the things that's being discussed under the framework is, for NatHERS ratings, a system where when you finish going through the NatHERS tool, what you might do is have the assessor work on his computer. That might then be loaded up into the cloud or the internet somewhere, where the certificate that comes out of the NatHERS tool is then produced in a consistent way. It allows for some cost recovery, I'd have to say. And it also means that there then is a centralized database where a lot of information about buildings that are coming in Australia would be available for research purposes, as long as we can make sure we protect the privacy provisions as much as we need to. And the other thing is that in doing that, one of the things we would hope to do is make sure that standard certificate that comes out of it is a bit more helpful in terms of compliance. So, for example, one of the things we'd like to do is make sure that in that certificate, you get the rating of the house. Out of that, the tool can probably identify, here are the 3 or 4 or 5 main things that you need to check that actually deliver that energy efficiency performance, so that when the certifier certifies the house, they can check the things that really make a difference and make sure that they're in place, because energy efficiency is hard to certify. So if we can give them a bit of guidance, that would help. So that's what's that about. In terms of the governance, just very quickly, the intention is that the framework itself, which currently is often has been often a sort of special process, will be rolled into one of our standing ministerial councils, most likely the Standing Council on Climate Change, Standing Committee on Climate Change, Select Council on Climate Change, the SCCC, which is a ministerial council that looks after climate change issues, including energy efficiency and adaptation and some other issues. And so that seems like the sensible place to develop this framework. And ideally, we'd like to bring in all the rating tool work into that same council as well. So the framework, the NatHERS work, which is currently done in that same council, we need to think about ways we can bring the neighbour system into that framework in a way that works for both neighbours and for consistency across these tools as well. So that's the idea, is to bring all that into a single framework and therefore have an ability to look at all these issues in a strategic way across all the different concerns. So where do we go next? So we've had this discussion paper. We're in the public consultation period. When that finishes, the states and territories, the Commonwealth will get together again and consider the feedback, including the feedback from these meetings as well as the written feedback. and on that basis try to finalize up something that, the issues that can be resolved, and present that to governments hopefully by around the end of this year. And that would allow a sort of staged rollout starting from 2013. So this is not going to be something where, you stitch up the document and it's done. It's going to have to be rolled out over quite a bit of time, and that's what we have in mind. So just in terms of the, again, hopefully you've all seen this website since you're here, but if not, these are the addresses if you want to find any of these documents. Again, I would encourage you to take a USB, or just if you have questions or information or need information, that's the address. On the USB and on the website are these forms for making submissions. This just helps us make sure that we, keep track of your submission, and make sure the information can be distributed to different jurisdictions so they can all consider it. All of these will be made public unless you tell us you don't want it to be made public, so just be aware of that. And just before closing then, as I say, we're very keen to get feedback here and hear questions. Gordon and I will take notes as we go along, so we do keep track of what's raised here, but we do encourage you to make a submission, and in particular if you have particular issues, give us the detail of why you think things, and particularly if you have clear evidence for one issue or another. The more evidence we get, the better we can feel comfortable with making the right decisions. There are some specific things that are identified in the discussion paper that we'd like some feedback on. Again, this issue of these goals, these numerical goals that we talked about for the residential and commercial sectors, do they seem right? Are they too weak, too strong, whatever? The question of whether to go to this 10-point scale, so the 10-star rating scale for everything. And I think the issue here is there's a logic to going to a 10-star scale and how you can get a more systematic approach, but there's a cost as well, and particularly for tools which don't have 10-star scales, you need a transition period, and is it worth the cost of going to that 10-star scale for the benefits that you get? Should we have single tools or multiple tools? As we talked about, there are, again, costs and benefits either way, but we're interested in views. The view of the group is pretty strong that we should allow some of these trade-offs between the thermal shell and some of these fixed appliances and the other things. Having said that, it's also a view of the group that we should not relax any thermal shell requirements. So the existing requirements would remain the sort of minimum, and then as you move forward, you would allow this flexibility across them. And I think there's a fairly strong bit of support for that, but again, your views on that would be very welcome. This issue of whether to include on-site generation is probably one that there's less clarity on, and so views on that would be quite good to get. And if people have evidence for what that does or doesn't do, that would be good. And then finally, should residential building standards be harmonized across all jurisdictions? That's probably a particularly relevant issue for New South Wales, given that they do have a slightly different system. Should we require accrediting or licensing of assessors? Again, I think the arguments for that are pretty clear. Probably the main alternative view is, well, that's going to raise costs possibly. So, is that worth it? Is that really necessary? And if people have views on governance arrangements for all these things, we'd be quite happy to hear that as well. So, yeah, one more time, I'll encourage you to, more than happy to answer questions, hear your issues, we'll take those down, and I would really encourage people to, make a written submission as well, because that's what we're on about. So thanks very much. Any questions? So the question was how many neighbours ratings. Now, Amy, you're probably a better place to handle this than I am.
Not neighbours, neighbours.
Oh, NatHERS. Okay. How many are there? I don't know is the short answer. There's about 100,000 a year nowadays. So I think there's it varies depending on how much the global financial crisis has hit, but about 100 to 150,000 houses built a year. I think about 70% are approved using the NatHERS system. So about 70% of that. So about 100,000 a year, more or less. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we don't actually.
We don't know for sure, but something like that, yeah. And that's one of the things we want to fix. And in neighbours, there are 1,200. What was it? Yeah. Other questions? Don't be shy. It's not really television. It's just the web. No. Yes.
Ian Fry's my name. I just wanted to find out in relation to there's lots of things happening at the moment in the building regulation, all having different scenarios. The BCA has now got 6 stars across this place. New South Wales is talking about upgrading basics. Is this all being considered as part of this framework? I mean, there seems to be, and we've got mandatory disclosure, which seems to be operating off on the side somewhere. We've got commercial disclosure, which is happening. What is the plan to bring all of this together? Because at the moment there seems to be lots of things happening around the place and different associations and different people talking about different things, but here we're looking at this all coming under the one umbrella, but it's very hard to see that from where we're at the moment.
Yeah. You know, that slide with the umbrella, which again I think should be a podium, but is kind of the issue. So commercial building disclosure does exist. It uses neighbours as the tool for compliance with CBD. And there's discussion nationally, there's been some discussion about how a national residential disclosure scheme would be rolled out. And in doing that, one of the key issues is if there's a tool-based disclosure mechanism, and that's not decided, but if there was, how do we make sure that that tool is cost-effective but also consistent with the NatHERS rating so that you get information which is useful, again, across this sort of life cycle of the thing. So I think the framework is trying to provide, it deals with standards specifically, but then it also deals with these rating tools that can support both regulatory and voluntary programs and tries to provide that system. So it's really just an enabling mechanism for that. It doesn't determine the outcomes of any of those other processes, but it tries to make sure that as much as possible, all those different elements link together and are thought about in terms of how they link to each other. In terms of the issues with basics, the 2010 improvement to the BCA has now been rolled out, I think, in all jurisdictions except the Northern Territory and Tasmania, and New South Wales has its basic systems, which is a bit different. What this framework would do is move the national construction code system closer to the basic system. They look more similar than they do now. I can't speak for New South Wales, but you know, what we're looking at is whether there's a way down the track we can move to a system that's, you know, nationally fully consistent. I think this will get us some of the way, but probably not quite there yet. I don't know if Amy, you wanted to.
You have to adopt basics.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the issue. I think the issue is that it's become. I think that's part of the issue, from what I've seen, is that it's become very much a political football. I mean, no matter whichever state you're in, no one's really willing to sort of bud. They all think their own system's the best system, and New South Wales is obviously very adamant about basics. But you talk about basics in Victoria or Queensland and that sort of stuff, and nobody really wants to hear about it.
Yeah, look, I think that would have been a fair statement, you know, 5 years ago or something. I think things have moved a bit, and I think, you know, people recognise the strengths of basics, and they recognise some of the other issues, in the same way that I think everybody recognises the strengths of the National Construction Code system and its weaknesses. I think one of the issues is that basics is done by the planning system, and I think in every other jurisdiction it's done through the building approval system, so it's not quite in the same space, and that's something we need to think about. But there's certainly, you know, a lot of the elements that are in this framework are basically saying let's take some of the best elements of basics and build them into the national system. So, yeah, I think things have moved on and it's improving, but we're not quite there yet.
If you're talking about standardising the rating tools so that each of the rating tools has a 10-star certificate or up to 10 stars, when OEH went to the industry in regards to increasing the neighbours ratings from 5 stars to 6, why didn't they take into consideration moving to 10 stars immediately or adjusting the scale?
Again, Amy, you can answer this later if you want, but I think the issue was that the reason neighbours had always been designed to be 7 stars. 7 was sort of the notional zero emissions point. 5 stars was enough because at the time neighbours was started, 5 stars was seen as a pretty high standard that really nobody would ever meet, or at least it would take a long time before anybody ever got there. In fact, once the system came into place, people moved up to that 5-star level and beyond much faster than people had put in place. So I think the decision that, and I sit on I chair the National Steering Committee for Neighbours, so the decision we faced was, well, we could wait for the framework to sort of play itself out and then see whether we want to move to 10 stars. But that could take some time while we sort that out. Or we could add the 6-star effectively in the current system so that we have a way of recognizing those buildings that have gone well beyond the 5-star rating. And then think about whether we want to realign the system at a later date. And I think that was the basic thinking behind it. But it also raises the issue of, people understand what a 5-star building is in neighbors, sort of, most people. If we did shift the scale to 10, it would require a much bigger re-education exercise to make sure that everybody understood that. And that's one of the questions of, is the communications value of moving to this consistent system worth the cost of having to have that re-education, that sort of transition period that we go through? And that's really the debate that's going on. But fundamentally it was about needing to recognize those buildings in the short term that have really gone well beyond 5 stars while we try to sort out some of these longer term issues. Yeah.
Hi, Roger Hills here from APSA. I'm just wondering with the framework, if you've had a chance to drill down to some of the realities behind some of those targets. For example, with, say, assessors, there would be, we've calculated there's probably about 2,200 assessors in Australia all up who do energy ratings for NATOs. We've probably got about 450 of those who are actually accredited. So our experience is that probably only about 20% of all the energy raters out there do about 80% of the work. So when you look at those 150,000 houses built around Australia, it's a vanishingly small group of people who actually do most of those accreditations. And so when you start to look at the practicalities of paying for accreditation, paying for training, paying for CPD, paying for quality assurance of all those things, it starts to become extremely expensive for such a small group of people. And it's the same problem for the software developers. Because it's such a small group of people, they're not making any money out of it to be able to do further development work. So there's a lot of economics involved with these changes that are hidden beneath the directions that the framework's put in. I mean, I fully support the framework, but at the same time, I don't know if there's any work that's been done at that other level to say, okay, well, if we're going to go down that pathway, here are the cost implications for it for the industry itself.
Some. At this stage, probably not a lot, because we're still trying to get to the stage of, what we think are sensible things to do, and then the question is, can we actually afford to do it? But the cost issues clearly have been considered. So one of the key reasons behind the idea of moving to a single tool rather than multiple tools would be, in fact, to allow that one tool to have a bit more of a, financial security base. In terms of assessors, it's an interesting issue, and you can sort of look at it different ways. If you can keep the cost of accreditation and assessment low, it allows lots and lots of assessors to be in the marketplace, most of whom don't do very many assessments, and therefore your quality, you probably need more quality control. As soon as you start paying for more quality control, the cost of it rises, and you actually shrink it down to a smaller number of assessors who do more, and therefore can share those higher costs across a larger number of assessments. But also it means, it can mean that the quality assurance becomes easier and more reliable. And that's really what a lot of that licensing and accreditation bit about, is to say, well, maybe we don't want 2,000 assessors because we don't want that many assessors who only do, half a dozen ratings a year and really don't keep up to date and, don't understand the tools as well as the people who do them more. So while I don't think we've gone through and actually done the costing exercise, the issue of the cost and benefits of the different approaches is certainly something that's very much in our minds. But in fact, it's something that you can give us, really good. You'd be in the best place to actually, give us information on that. So that'd be good to get. No, there's no drinks. I have to tell you.
Bruce Precious from GPT. So the market is very familiar with using neighbours in the voluntary context and for reporting performance of existing buildings. So we're now talking about it in the regulatory context. Could you talk a little bit more about how it would apply in the National Construction Code?
Okay. I'm not sure it would apply in the National Construction Code, I guess, is the easiest answer to that. I think what we'll be looking at is, one of the bits of work that's related to this that we've been doing, which you know about, is trying to line up the assumptions that underlie Green Star, neighbours, and Section J of the building code. So things like, I can't remember what they call it, but the amount of heat each body is assumed to produce each day while it's in the building, which are different in all three of those tools, and just makes no sense. So part of what we do is want to make sure that where there are sensible assumptions that should be lined up, we line them up. Down the track, and part of the thinking there is that in the future, and this is not decided yet by any means, but in the future it may be that you could use something like a neighbour's commitment agreement as your way of demonstrating compliance with the building code, and then that would be very consistent with then later on getting actual neighbours assessments as you go forward. So we don't have, we're not there yet, but I think we're starting to look at how can we set up systems so that that sort of approach is viable. And the first step to that is to make sure that all the assumptions that are in the neighbours commitment agreements match up with the ones that are in Section J, so at least you're working from the same base. Again, the idea of this really fully comprehensive and consistent set of rating tools, I think is a fair way down the track, but we need to start making the small steps so that we can get there in the longer term in the future. I'm not sure that answers your question at all, but that's what I've got. No? Okay. Well, look, unless then, people really have something they want to say. I'll just say one more time, thanks very much for coming along. Do take a USB and, pick up the documents. And really, we really do want your feedback, so, whatever you can give us, we'd be very happy to receive. And the contacts are there if you have questions or things along the way. And thanks very much to New South Wales for organising. So, thank you.